As we move around the room, we go into the library and see a vast collection of early radio keys. And here we have all kinds of keys used by the radio operator, both the ham and the commercial operator. There are little side swipers, all kinds of automatic, semi-automatic bugs, and huge keys used on board ships. One of these large keys, by the way, weighs 12 pounds. This is a very fine collection of early keys. On this board are many phonograph records. One can actually see the development of the phonograph record starting with Edison's first cylinder. It was a Hill and Dale vertical cut record dated back to the turn of the century. And then you see the very first of the flat disc records. One of them is dated 1905, and the others progressively through the years right up into the 1930s. In the upper right is a large electrical transcription record used in a broadcast station. Also on display are many different types of pickups that were used in early broadcast work. Now we enter the room and are in the 1925 store. If one went into a store back in 1925, this is what you'd see. There are stocks of receivers of the period on the shelves. The showcases are full of 1925 vintage parts, and there's a stock of radio tubes. I might add that in this store, we have several old receivers operating so you can hear music of the past. It's a very entertaining place, particularly for the collector. Adjacent to the store, we have another section of early telegraph equipment. We have dozens and dozens of early relays, sounders, and telegraph equipment used at the turn of the century. Note the clock. This is a Western Union clock that came out of the Rochester Western Union office, and I believe it was installed before World War I. In this same section, you can see primary cells and early recording devices such as Morse registers and so on. And I might add that a lot of this telegraph equipment is operational. One can actually operate the key or bug and hear the sounders click. Moving a little further into the room, we are in what we call the commercial section. We're looking at an installation of what would have been on board a ship in 1920 right after the First World War, possibly during that war. We have two 1,000-watt quenched gap spark transmitters. That's right, 1,000-watt commercial spark transmitters of World War I vintage, and of the quenched gap type. One of them, by the way, is a Marconi transmitter. In between the transmitters, you can see the receiving equipment. There are Marconi and wireless specialty apparatus receivers of the commercial type. Of course, equipment of this type is of great value to the collector. We're looking at the 1,000-watt quenched gap Marconi spark transmitter. This, by the way, was given to the association by the United States Coast Guard. At the end of this room, you can see early broadcast equipment. The large black rack transmitter at the left came from W2XR. W2XR preceded WQXR, the New York Times station in New York City. It was a high-fidelity station and pioneered in hi-fi broadcasts. This is the original transmitter, which the association obtained from the owner's son in Long Island. On the shelf, one sees early microphones of the 1920s up through the 30s, all kinds. Single button, double button, condenser, ribbon, other types of mics used in broadcast work. In addition, there are the early monitoring receivers made by Western Electric, which are quite rare. All of the early broadcast stations had to monitor 600 meters, the SOS band, and Western Electric made those receivers. Now, leaving this room, we will go up to the third floor, and here we are. We're looking at a modern amateur radio station of about 1917 vintage, or immediately after the war in 1920. At the left is a 1,000-watt synchronous rotary spark transmitter. It's the original. It was not made up in recent years, but was taken off the air in 1922. It was made by the first president of the Antique Wireless Association, George Batterson, whose call used to be 8TC. This is the 1-kilowatt sync rotary spark transmitter he used back there in 1921 and 22. A little closer look at the receiving section shows the equipment you would find in the station in 1920 and 21. At the right is a Reinhardt's receiver, and at the left, that is an early Greeby receiver. both contemporary of the early 20s. And note the green board in the center of the picture with the open wiring. That is open cleat wiring, typical of the wiring used in 1916 through 1923. This was installed to show visitors what wiring really looked like in some of these early stations. The next picture is the 1,000-watt sync rotary spark set. One cannot see the lower section too well, but in it is the huge spark transformer and the oil condenser. The glass condenser plates are immersed in oil. On top is the rotary gap, a huge oscillation transformer. We use this transmitter for demonstration purposes occasionally, only for a very few moments. It's quite deafening, making a lot of noise, and of course it does cause some interference, so naturally its operation is minimized. It is interesting to see this kilowatt rock crusher in operation and to watch as one throws it in and out of sync as the 60-cycle voltage with 120 peaks comes into sync. In another corner of the room, we see an amateur station of about 1922 or 1923. In the background are all the QSL cards of the 1920s. QSL cards became popular about 1922, and from that time on, of course, the amateurs exchanged cards. These cards don't have a W on their calls, as they did not start to use the W until 1927. For a short time before 1924, they used U before the call letters, then NU, and finally, as a result of international regulations, W became part of the call. At the right of this picture, you can see the receiving equipment. There are a couple of Grebe receivers. There's a Zenith and the Chicago Radiolab CRL, which was a popular receiver of the times, developed by 9ZN R.H.G. Matthews. In addition, there's another Reinhardt's tuner. On the upper deck is a DeForest interpanel receiver. All this equipment is usable. This station, 2AN, actually has been on the air. When it is, of course, we have to operate on 160 meters because in 1922 the amateur was not operating on 80 or 40. Those wavelengths were strictly for experimental work. Most operations, particularly in 1921, was still on 200 meters. This station was made and set up for operation on 200 meters, so to make it operational today, we merely tapped down on the coils and ended up on 160. This is a close-up of the transmitter, 2AN. Of course, when we're on the air, we use W2AN. The transmitter is on the upper shelf. It's authentic. Every part of the transmitter is 1922 vintage. And starting at the left of the transmitter, the circuit is a UV202 Hartley oscillator. That drives the UV202 buffer stage, which in turn drives a UV203 final amplifier. The audio section is at the right. A single button carbon mic is used with a UV201 speech amplifier driving another UV202 to drive a UV203 Heising modulator. We obtain possibly 20 or 30% modulation at best, but it does modulate the signal, and on occasions we operate on phone on 160. At the bottom of the picture are some jars with whitish material in them. Many visitors think they're batteries, but they're not. They're chemical rectifiers. In the early days, stations either used raw AC on the plate or they used some type of self-rectification. But the better stations used batteries, motor generators, or chemical rectifiers. We selected chemical rectifiers. They are rather spectacular. They consist of lead and aluminum plates in jars, and the chemical is just plain baking soda.